So, this episode is for all of you who may think, my vote doesn't matter. I don't vote. I would get involved, but I don't know how or where to volunteer. I don't have any special election related skills or really anything along those lines. You may have even said these things out loud, or you may have heard friends or family say this, even if it's not you. Either way, this episode is for you.
Now, we said in our email this week that we were getting ready to dive into election 2024 because I'm not political or I don't talk about politics is not going to cut it. These days, politics is invading our libraries, schools, wallets, and bodies, and those of our children as well. So in this episode, we bring you an incredible activist and supporter of activists who will leave you with not only the best approach to engage people in your life who say they don't do politics, but also a bunch of organizations you can get involved with between now and November that we think will make a huge difference to the trajectory of our nation. And P.S., if you aren't yet on our email list, what are you thinking? Get on it. Register at dearwhitewomen.com. Welcome to the Dear White Women podcast, the show that helps white women use their privilege to uproot systemic racism and all the other isms we're facing right now without centering themselves in the process. We are your multi-ethnic hosts, Sarah and Misasha. So our guest today is currently focused on the November 2024 U.S. election and helping folks to get involved and feel empowered. So would you please introduce yourself for our audience?
Sure. My name is Sam Chavez. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a queer white Latina activist who is currently based in the Bay Area, but I grew up in Texas and my ancestors and family lineage come from New Mexico. So I really represent so many different intersectionalities despite having very white skin. And in terms of my professional career, I founded the Roots of Change Agency in 2020 to support activists, Heart First Humans, and social change communicators to do storytelling and communication a little bit differently. So it's really about kind of decolonizing how we view what people call marketing, but I try to refer to as storytelling. And I'm also very much involved in electoral politics through Swing Left San Francisco, Sister District, and other organizations.
I love that you bring such a breadth of identity and experience to what you openly owned as like white people presume you're white. And, you know, it really challenges all the assumptions that we make about people without knowing their story and to take the time to understand that. So I'm excited to talk with you because I feel like you can speak to many different audience members listening, because it goes without saying that this is a tremendously significant presidential election coming up in November 2024. And on top of that, I think there's a lot of down ballot issues and down ballot people that we ought to be considering, right? Because that local community is really where you feel the impact of your election choices. One of the things I want to start by addressing is that it feels like there's a twofold challenge. There's an emotional and practical challenge to getting people involved. And so if we can tackle the emotions first, let's talk about our feelings. Because I think 2/3, about 66% of the voting eligible population turned out for the 2020 presidential election. Now, that was the highest rate for any national election since the 1900, which is amazing. And yet, I think based on anecdotal experience, we're still finding people who are like, my vote won't matter. You know, I don't do politics. I don't vote. How do we get people to care? Can we get people to care? And what do you do when someone says that to you?
Yeah, well, first of all, if someone asks me that question, I end up asking a lot of questions to them, because I think one of the biggest mistakes that folks make when they get into activism is like, we have to change everyone. Let's change everyone's mind. Let's just get everyone on board with our opinions. And that's just not how minds change. Really, a lot of it is about asking questions and listening and understanding why people are feeling that way. There's a lot of different reasons why people would be frustrated with voting. If you are someone in a marginalized community, it can take hours to vote. And I also understand like the frustrations around government inaction. So really what I try to do is ask where that kind of thread comes from and what they really care about. So getting into the personal fears and hopes and desires of that person, you can then tap into what is the thing that's actually going to get them to want to be involved in politics. because we use politics as like a word, but at the end of the day, what is politics? Like politics is our lives. Like politics is being able to have enough food on the table. It's being able to have a living wage to support your family. All of these things are political in nature because our politicians are making those decisions regardless of if we're voting for them or not. So I would much rather be participating in that than letting politicians kind of run roughshod over however they want to vote.
I love the questions approach because I think that's such an important piece that's often missing in when we're thinking about why people do what they do.
Misasha, did you do a TEDx talk recently on the power of questions?
Something along those lines.
Yeah. All right. Just thought I'd slide that in there.
It is definitely very close to my heart. And I'm also in the Bay Area and just was reading a sister district email before we got on this. So that's going to lead into sort of what Sarah had teed up, which is the practical side of this, right? Because once people have identified, maybe that issue that they're really interested in, or, they realize that they care more deeply about certain things than they thought previously, what do we want people to do then? Or how do we get people to do that? Because like I hear so many people say when I talk to them about this, like, oh, I don't really have any, skills related to elections. I'm not a lawyer like you are. I can't help with voting rights or election protection. But, I think we know for a fact that that's not all that goes into elections, right? So in your opinion and experience, what are some of the most effective ways to get involved? And do you have any particular organizations that you would suggest as sort of a starting point or places for people to look into?
Yeah, great question. I definitely want to get into like all of the top ways that are most impactful for the election. I think to address like coming in new to activism, I totally understand that kind of nervousness feeling of like, oh my gosh, there's this huge array of activism. Like, where do I even plug in? How do I start? And that's totally normal. So I think the biggest thing is just like ingesting and learning what you like and what organizations are most aligned with what you are wanting to do and what change you're wanting to make. For me, I am focused on kind of 3 to 4 main organizations for the November election. So Working Party's Family, the Swing Left, which I'm a part of the San Francisco chapter, Sister District, and then the Northeast Arizona Native Democrats. All of those are organizations that are working on the ground and talking with voters to impact their races. So the Working Party's Family is a national organization and they have local chapters. So you can easily plug in to any of those organizations and automatically find a phone bank, automatically find a canvas. And there's a lot of trainings too, I would recommend. So if you're at all nervous about entering into volunteering, there's a lot of easy entryways to just feel a little bit better about that. In terms of what is the most impactful thing for people to do from now until November is 1, make sure that you are voting, but 2, talking to other voters. So that could be talking to your friends and family about if they have a voting plan, making sure that they're registered, that they understand when early voter registration is happening. That can be something as simple as just during the dinner conversation, you bring that up versus phone baking and canvassing, which is really about Democrats and other folks coming together and calling within swing districts to flip votes during those stations. So for Swing Left San Francisco, we're really focused on the Central Valley in California, which we lost a few key races last year in 2022, which we lost the House because of those races, as well as some other races in New York. And then Sister District is an amazing organization. So it's really amazing, Ms. Asha, that you're a part of that as well. They work at the local level. So it's all about flipping state seats and other local seats. And that's really crucial because when it comes to local races, the difference between a win and a loss could be a few dozen votes. And that can be made up within like 1 or 2 phone baking sessions. So it's really empowering when you do feel that like you are really making a difference when you're making those calls.
I love that. Misasha, what are some of the other organizations that you also support? Because I know we mentioned some of the more left-leaning groups. I know there's also nonpartisan groups. There's stuff like, is it VoteForward, like the postcard writing organizations? Like, what are some of the other ones that I just want to make sure we're giving everyone an array of organizations to look into?
Yeah, Vote Forward's a great one. My parents, who are retired, have been spending their time actually writing postcards to voters in Arizona, making sure that they are aware that abortion is on the ballot in Arizona and that they're getting out there to vote for that. So that is something you can do with, zero prior skills or, anything besides some stamps and a pen, really. Black Voters Matter is one that we support with our family. And I know Kate Schatz had mentioned it on a prior episode that we had done for the podcast, which really looks at communities designed to really focus on Black voters and voices that have historically not been heard in election cycles. As Sam was mentioning earlier, too, these are sometimes the communities that feel like their votes are not being heard or do not matter, but often make a huge impact in how elections go. I will say for the lawyers also, there's a lot of different election protection ways that you can do. You can volunteer through your state's party, like I have volunteered through CADEM and have monitored to make sure that polling and vote centers are safe and accessible during the actual in-person voting periods. But there's also, if you go to 866rvote.org, that links you to a lot of different information, including election protection materials for people who are volunteering for the polls. And that's another way, Sarah, that you can also get involved, because I know you have been looking into this to volunteer to be a poll worker, or to work at a vote center, because early voting starts early, right? So there are opportunities to do that and get paid to do that throughout October and into November.
Those are all great.
I actually have worked as a poll worker for a few years now, and I'll say it is such a fun job because it's nonpartisan and people are so excited to vote. We see like dogs coming in, little kids asking for I voted stickers. So it's just a really warm feeling. And it's a great way for me to not stress on election day because I'm very focused on getting people voting.
I love all of these. And I hope that people take from it what struck them most and they take that extra step to go look into it and go get yourself sign up and do something, whatever lit you up just now, whatever you heard. I want to shift the conversation a little bit, unless you have more to add on the organization side of it, to like the content of what is at risk this year.
The only thing I would add is when it comes to like talking to voters, like I am an introvert and I totally understand that a lot of people are really fearful about getting on the phone or knocking on doors and talking to strangers. It is not as scary as people assume it is. Like you get on your first call and you have one good conversation with a voter and you are like buoyed and energetic for the rest of the day. And so that's something that I always tell people is like, if you are anxious and nervous about the election, go call voters because that's going to change your mood around and you're going to feel like the action and the hope because you're doing something.
I love that. Thank you for addressing that part, like the practical meshed with the emotional. We are going to be talking to introverts who are going to be feeling that way, like me right here. Call with you. All right, then let's make this transition. I'm going to insert a side note here, because if you're interested in learning more about our viewpoints here on Dear White Women on the Election, check out episodes 244 to 246. And their titles are things like Why We Need to Take Trump at His Word and Why Trump is Bad for Your Well-Being. So go take a listen to episode 244, 245, and 246 if you want to know a little bit more. Now, Sam, I'm curious, how are you looking at the election decision for the presidency this year?
I am looking at it as a strategic decision in how we move forward true and lasting social change. I'm really looking at from all the way down ballot, like who are the candidates that are going to allow me as an organizer to continue to fight for the things that I care about and continue to advance that, knowing that we're not going to get everything that we want out of this election. So to put that more bluntly, like I am voting for Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, and I will be voting Democrat down the ticket. And I am very strategic about just making sure that I am focused on those progressive Democrats. So I mentioned the Working Party's family earlier. Working Families Party, I always say that backwards. They are really focused on bringing more people from lower income backgrounds into electoral politics and building a momentum there. And so that's where I really look at my guidance for.
Thank you for sharing that. And I appreciate what you said about, understanding that this election will not be perfect, right? No one is going to come out thinking like, I got everything that I wanted, most likely. And I think that that's an important thing to remember, because I think sometimes we get caught up in this idea like, well, I need this, or on the concept of the perfect candidate, right? And I think that that is an impossible standard, right, to hold us to. And it really creates a level of inertia sometimes around more progressive candidates that, with the framework that you were talking about, that can continue to support working for change, even if they may not check all of the boxes. And I want to talk a little bit about down ballot too, because you mentioned, voting Democratic down the ballot. And I think it's so important because in presidential election years, everyone talks about, the presidential race and sometimes the VP race. And then everyone's like, okay, well, I guess there's some other stuff going on, but, I'm just going to vote this and I'll just, check these boxes. But sometimes down ballot, and especially those local issues and elected officials, have a much more, as Sarah and I have talked about in several episodes, a much greater impact on your day-to-day life, right? So what are those down ballot considerations that you think we should be thinking about when we vote? And are there any in particular that you are focused on for your communities? And I ask this because as a parent, for example, like I always, and especially in these last few elections, I'm super focused on school boards, right? And who comprises our school boards? Because, I think that there are so many things that go into every electoral cycle. And so would love to get your take on down ballot
Yeah,
considerations.
I really appreciate that focus, because I think even just if you look at the president, like we talk about Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, but at the end of the day, we're voting for an administration and we're voting for a lot more people. So for me, I'm voting for FTTC Lena Khan. I'm voting for Deb Haaland. I want to see this continued progress within the federal government, and to make sure that if we do have a Harris-Walz presidency, that we have the House and the Senate to support them. That is so important. And that's where I'm focused, is the swing left San Francisco. Our focus is mainly in those Western swing districts and areas. So we're focused on Arizona, Nevada, which are both swing states for the presidential election, but they both have very important state elections as well. In Nevada, I met with Dallas Harris, who's running for state Senate in Las Vegas. And she is a Black queer woman who grew up in the region. And she's really focused on those local issues of just making sure people have, again, like that living paycheck, that they have childcare. So yeah, it's really important to be focused on your state and your local elections. In California, we have a lot of ballot initiatives. So those are really important to make sure that you're moving your state and your county forward. But yeah, I think that going back to the school board races, that's so important, because we talk about the threats of this election. There are a lot of folks who are in the MAGA movement that are focused on these local races. And it's important that our side is also focused on building the talent and the candidates at the local race, because those people are going to be Kamala Harris one day. Kamala Harris was a local elected official in San Francisco.
I think that's so important to remember and to follow people through their trajectory. I guess this is a slightly different question in that you're talking about supporting candidates, doing the work through organizations and reaching out to potential voters and engaging with them in conversation to hopefully exchange information and get them to see why you support the viewpoints that you do, and have them vote that way. I had an incident recently that Misasha knows about where I am seeing falsehoods being posted on social media. Like, Kamala Harris wants to increase capital gains taxes to 25%. So your mom's house, she's going to have to take out a loan in order to pay taxes on her house. So I had to say something. But we've talked in the past about how social media is not the place to necessarily engage and change people's minds. What do you think about the most effective way to communicate with people? And what do you do when you see them posting things or sharing misinformation?
I think we have to acknowledge that there is a ton of different disinformation right now. My friend is working with a disinformation organization where they are literally working with campaigns and other organizations to make sure that they're aware of the disinformation that's happening so that those organizations can tackle that. But again, I think it's about asking those questions to the people that you trust while also protecting yourself. I think when it comes to social media, we are going to react really quickly. And if we can kind of take that pause and then react more in our truest selves, that's going to allow us to move forward and create the change that we're wanting to create. So in terms of like, if it's just a random person on social media, maybe don't start that fight in the comments. It might not really be worth it for your time and your energy. But if it's a friend, have that conversation, reach out to them directly, ask them where they got that information. And then from a personal perspective, I would say really understand like what are the news sources that you trust. And it's all about kind of verifying and not trusting any small fact. So kind of understanding that kind of larger picture of what's going on, and then verifying if you see a fact with multiple sources.
I'm all about fact verification. My favorite question is, besides why, but in this election cycle, it's definitely, can you tell me where you heard that? Or, can you tell all about sources? And I was having this conversation with my older son recently, and last year in their US history, they used a website called PolitiFact, where they got to look up, it basically ranks truth of politicians' statements, and it also ranks presidents by overall truth levels of their statements. But regardless of the website, it was a great exercise for him to start thinking about like, oh, all of what politicians say are not necessarily true. And how do we go about thinking critically about what is said? So I also like to use, Sarah knows I'm not a big social media person, nor am I a big engager on social media, but I do like to use those moments to like sometimes talk to my older son about like, hey, how to develop critical thinking skills so that hopefully this next generation comes along and we have protected some level of that ability to think critically and think about, where did I hear that? How truthful is that source? And especially as they're looking at this election cycle as well.
Yeah. And I think it's especially important on social media because social media is so much about emotion and less about fact. And when we look at the data around like how people change their minds, they don't change their minds based off of facts. They change them based off of emotions. So knowing that people are coming in with emotion first, that's why I'm like, don't really start arguing in the comments because like adding facts and stuff is not really going to help when someone is like emotionally fired up over an issue. So it's really about that balance and like kind of helping people come back into a grounded space so that they can then listen. And also, to your point, like, where did you hear that? How is that informing your overall life view and things like that?
I love that. It ties into this idea of storytelling that is what you started with. And how can we make sure we know why these issues matter to us in a personal way so we can connect with the emotions and share that with the people we're talking about, why these things matter, who is it going to impact, how is it going to impact them? And so making sure we know that about ourselves will really be helpful when we're interacting with other people as well. And as I'm hearing you talk, I'm feeling like this, whether it's social media engagement, talking to your kids, doing the work with these organizations is a lot of work. Everybody is going to be like, well, but I'm busy. So where does this work rank and how important do you think this work should be for everybody listening between now and the election? And then the second part of that is, how do we protect our well-being while we're doing this?
Yes, I'm so glad you asked that second question. I mean, I'm not going to tell anyone exactly how to rank their lives because everyone's lives are different, but I really encourage people to, if you have never done a phone bank, you've never done a canvas, try one or two now until November. I think that, this is really important. I think in the grand scheme of things of how we create social change, like we do need to be looking outside of the electoral view. But at the same time, we are 2 months away from a hugely consequential election. And I want to make sure that I wake up in a positive, hope-filled vision of our country versus the authoritarian vision that Trump has.
Absolutely. So then how do you know when enough is enough for a day or protect your well-being? And then also tell us about the sessions you're hosting after the election for everyone who's volunteering and doing all the work between now and November.
Yeah. So what I usually recommend for people is like, I have been envisioning this surfboard riding on the waves of the surfboard. And if anyone surfs, which I do not, you have to use your knees. You have to like get up on the level and get down on the level. Like now until November, we don't know what's going to happen. There's going to be a lot of things that are going to be thrown our way. The way that I'm really thinking about it is I know what my role is in this election, and all of the kind of noise that's going to happen in the news is not really going to distract me from what that goal is. Hopefully, hopefully nothing from the news like really turns things around too much. So I think it's really about like not freaking out too much about the ups and downs, and also really having like a core to yourself and like being strong and understanding like I can control what I can control. And so that's where, just doing a little bit of every time. I do think like notice your body, notice how you're feeling. If you're exhausted, take a nap, go walk in nature. It is so much better for you to recuperate and then go out and talk to voters than to burn yourself out. So I'm very much on that page. And then, yeah, so my friend and business partner and I, Britt Holmes, we have a monthly free workshop called Set Yourself Up Lunch and Learn for activists and social change communicators. And I believe it'll be the Wednesday after the election. We're hosting a like changing gears. Most of it's just going to be like, how's everyone doing? Are we doing okay? And doing some kind of supportive exercises, and then talking a little bit about, okay, how do you kind of recover from that and then move forward into whatever your next project is?
Thank you for sharing those. It sounds like such an important thing to talk about immediately after whatever happens at this election. And also, I think your point about, sort of the long game, right? This is a long game. This is not an immediate thing, and what we can control versus what we cannot, because it reminds me of my kids' coaches talking about the things you can control are attitude and effort, and everything else is kind of and those are your attitude and your effort, right? And that has to be in balance for the rest of everything to work. So I really appreciate you sharing that and reminding us about our energy and our ability to make change in this electoral cycle and in these like 2 months, which is still hard for me to believe that it is just 2 months. So I'm sure we could, talk for hours about all things election and vote and social change. But in the interest of time, is there anything else that we haven't asked that you'd like to share with our audience?
I think the one thing that I want to talk about is what my friend calls the margin of effort, which is like, again, just going back to how close some of these elections have been in the past. So Biden in 2020 won Arizona by 10,457 votes. So if you think about the entire state, that is so small when you break it down by district. And then when you think about the state races and the other local races, one of the Central Valley races in the District 13 lost by 564 votes in 2022. That person, Adam Gray, is back on the ballot. And we're working to make sure that we close the gap of those 564 votes. But again, like if you go out and you talk to voters, like you can be that change in some of these elections. And it's so cool. And it's such a powerful and hopeful feeling. So, and you get to brag afterwards. Like, if they win, you get to be like, yeah, I was the one that helped them win. I got those 5 votes over the line. So yeah, I really just encourage people to have active hope during this time. And that really means like doing the work and feeling that we are moving forward because each of us are doing our own little part.
I love that. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of your time and information with us. We'll be sure to link to both the post-election recovery session and also your Roots of Change agency. So if people are interested in learning more, they can come find you in our show notes and reach out to you that way. Thank you again so much. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just really appreciate getting to talk with both of you.
You've just listened to the Dear White Women podcast with your hosts, Sarah and me, Sasha. Yes, we're on social media. And yes, you can hire us to do talks about our book. But the biggest thing, don't forget to sign up for our newsletter to receive our free materials. Head over to dearwhitewomen.com to get on the list.